scientific consulting company ERM. I'm based in the UK, and we work with many companies to help them with their obligations under the Biocidal Product Regulation, both for active substances but also for products that companies place on the market. So the talk today is on ethylene oxide and the progress of that substance through its review under the regulation, and just a brief content of the talk today. So I think it's useful just to have a small amount of time just to look at some of the basics of the regulations and some of the key points that drive that legislation. And obviously the main body of the talk is to look at the current status of ethylene oxide. Some of the output of the current status of the review of that substance, which has become apparent from the outcome of the Biocidal Product Committee, and then look at the next steps, the potential actions and consequences of the review so far. So, starting with the basics. So I think there's three key points here. The first being that the regulation is an authorization process for products on the market. And that involves approval of the active substance that's contained in those products, and that operates at a European level. And then authorization of the products themselves, and that operates at an individual member state level where those products are placed on the market. So we have this kind of two-phase or two-step process in operation. So ethylene oxide is approaching the end of that first phase, so approaching the end of that European review under the regulation. And the review looks at essentially the safety of the substance, so safety for human health or safety for the environment, and also the basic efficacy of the substance, its inherent properties to control the organisms that are being targeted with that substance as a biocide. When it moves to the product authorization stage, it's a similar, essentially a safety review, but at the product stage, the efficacy becomes more focused, it's more targeted to the exact claims that are made on that biocidal product. So the review of biocides in Europe is a long process. It started under an old directive, 98/8, and the review program started back in the year 2000. And it reviewed all biocidal active substances on the market in May of 2000. I think there was greater than 800 that were looked at back at that time. So the whole process has taken a long time. So here we are in 2021, and we're only reaching the end of that first phase for ethylene oxide. Another key principle that was introduced by the regulation is exclusion criteria. That means substances that would not be approved under Article 5, simply based on their hazard classification. So not to do with risk or exposure, simply to do with the inherent hazardous properties of the substance. So as we know, ethylene oxide is a hazardous substance. It's a category 1B carcinogen, mutagen, and reproductive toxin, so it meets the criteria for exclusion under the regulation. But importantly, the regulation allows for derogations. So for those types of substances to be approved subject to certain criteria, which are listed in Article 5.2 of the regulation. And this essentially allows substances which are deemed to be essential for use to continue to be used and placed on the market. So the support of ethylene oxide as a biocidal active substance started back in the 2000s. A consortium was formed to submit the necessary technical dossier to the regulatory authorities back in 2007, 2008. And that dossier supports as a representative use the sterilization of single-use medical devices before they're placed on the market. The reason I say it's a representative use is because that's all that's required by the regulation at the active substance stage. It doesn't need to review all the potential uses. You just select a representative use that can then be assessed in terms of how the substance performs. The review of the active substances, it's a European process, but the technical review is done by a single member state authority. In this case, it was the Norwegian Environment Agency, which did the particular review for ethylene oxide. but other active substances are reviewed by other member states. It was just how the work was divided up back at that time. So it's taken more than 12 years to get where we are, which I think tells you how complex the process is and how time-consuming this whole regulatory arena is. And we've reached a stage where the known properties of ethylene oxide has placed it as a substance, as a candidate for substitution. So we're in a situation where we have to support the use of the substance on Article 5.2, which is to present evidence to show that it can be approved subject to the derogations. So that the properties can be mitigated, or the use is seen as essential to allow approval. So the process of confirming that derogation is led and driven by the Commission. And ultimately, it will be the Commission decision to approve the substance. As you can see there, there's various parts of the process, including public consultation. So users of the substance have the opportunity to submit the necessary justifications to allow the substance to be approved. So as part of the public consultation, and here is where we as a consultancy have been working with industry to develop the socioeconomic justifications for the continued use of ethylene oxide. And obviously emphasizing the importance of the substance for the healthcare sector. Ethylene oxide has very specific properties used in very specific ways that can't be substituted by other substances or other ways of sterilizing necessarily. So the final decision, and there's no firm timing on that decision at this moment, but will be the final vote at the Standing Committee. And if ethylene oxide is approved, it will receive that approval for 5 years. And after that time, you go into a process of renewal, so it will be renewed for another 5 years. So you have to make an application to renew the substance at quite short time intervals, and that's simply driven by the hazardous nature of the substance under the regulation. Okay, so I mentioned earlier the Biocidal Product Committee. I mean, that committee concludes the end of the technical review of the substance. So the experts in the member states have considered the evaluation by Norway. The various technical questions have been answered. And they consider the approval opinion. And in that approval opinion, it makes a summary of all the technical aspects of the substance. So we can see here on this slide these derived minimal effect levels. So these were effect concentrations which were concluded under the regulation. So the regulation sort of draws a framework around what it's considering. So these are numbers which are purely derived as a consequence of the regulation. So for workers, it was an airborne concentration of 3 parts per billion ethylene oxide, and for the general public, 0.06 parts per billion. That was simply within the confines of the regulation. As we know, there's an accepted and a working operator exposure level of 1 parts per million. But that was developed and concluded outside of the Biocidal Product Regulation. The two are not inextricably linked. So the values concluded under the regulation are not automatically applicable in any other regulatory sphere. So what happens next as a consequence of the regulation? Well, I think first and foremost is a discussion with the Commission on what could be the implications of the biocidal review. Will the examination of ethylene oxide under the regulation trigger actions or changes in other regulated areas? In particular, the operator at the OEL value of 1 ppm. And if these changes are going to happen, when, who's involved, by what mechanism will they change? But as I say, there's no automatic linkage, so there's no guarantee that there will be any changes at all. So this is looking a little bit at future needs in this area. So I think something that, certainly from a consultancy perspective, to be able to advise industry on best practice and the way forward under the regulation was to get a greater understanding of what the situation is today. So what are companies doing in terms of monitoring for ethylene oxide? How is this How is this taking place currently? What sort of methods are being used? How is the data generated? Which authorities are monitoring or receiving that data? And then to look forward to say, well, how could that technology be adapted? If the regulatory values are going to change to much lower levels, do we have the analytical techniques to be able to achieve monitoring at that level? And then how does that information then feed into the relevant agencies that are responsible for making those changes? In the biocidal product opinion, so the conclusions of the active substance review, you can see the requirements, the language which is used in that approval opinion document, here with respect to environmental monitoring. So it's requiring certain minimum standards for the abatement systems that are in place on ethylene oxide facilities. So it mentions catalytic converters or other devices that provide greater than 99.9% reduction in atmospheric emissions. It requires that monitoring data in air shall be provided for product authorization. And it says that monitoring in the vicinity of plants should be implemented to ensure that the concentrations remain below that DMEL for the general public, so remain below that 0.06 ppb value. That's the wish list. That's simply how the regulation has concluded its review. But obviously within those statements there's a very high degree of technical challenge, particularly the general public value at such a low level, being able to monitor airborne concentrations of ethylene oxide at extremely low levels. So currently for environmental monitoring, it usually takes place at the stack, so the actual direct emission from the sterilization plant. But to take that stack emission and move it to the fence line is almost a different sea change in analytical capability. So part of the conversation with the Commission is to get some more clarity around what this actually means. And is there a possibility to, shall we say, adapt or waive that regulatory conclusion, recognizing the practical limitations of what's actually possible, either with existing technology or even with more innovative technology in the future? And if you are going to measure airborne concentrations of ethylene oxide at the fence line, well, what's the framework around that? Frequency, where is the sampling located, who's responsible for it, and what are the consequences of exceedances? So there has to be a whole understanding of how that regulatory requirement is going to actually work in practice. And I think the only thing we can say today, there's no decisions. There's no clarity and no certainty on the way forward today. Another open point from the Biocidal Product Committee conclusions in their opinion is the need to have validated methods available in air. So again, on the left-hand side, we have a direct quote saying validated methods in air capable of detecting those DMEL values, the 3 ppb for workers, the 0.06 for general public, are available, or should be available. So it's a requirement for the companies supporting ethylene oxide to do the necessary technical work to develop those methods. And on the right-hand side, it's just making some comments of how we are going to communicate that technical effort to the Commission. Okay, so maybe just to summarize the current situation. So the top part, as of today, is the most important thing, is to provide the necessary socioeconomic justification why ethylene oxide should be approved under the regulation. Without that approval, everything else stops. If non-approval is granted, that's the finish of ethylene oxide. But we believe there's strong arguments that the substance should be approved because of its essentialness in the healthcare sector for sterilization, particularly of medical devices. So there's a clear societal need for the substance. So according to the regulation, if that's accepted, it should be approved. In parallel to that, and linked to that, is to meet with the Commission to understand in detail their understanding of how the regulatory conclusions are to be implemented. In particular, the need for enhanced worker and environmental monitoring. So what's the framework around that? How will that actually be put into place in practice? We have a clear requirement to develop new analytical methods to develop the ability to look and monitor ethylene oxide at those lower levels. And again, we seek Commission guidance on the relevance and applicability of those methods. And then we look forward to the product authorization stage. So we engage with member state authorities. So we've already made advances to Germany to act as the first reference member state. And then we look to the other market areas for ethylene oxide, the other countries that will require those authorizations in this mutual recognition process. So I think that's all I'd like to say today. I hope that's been reasonably clear in terms of a very brief summary of what is actually a very, very complicated and very, very difficult piece of chemical legislation. And of course, I'm available with our colleagues at SOLSTEO to answer any questions you have after the talk. So many thanks for your attention today.